So welcome back to WCCF Tech TV, everyone. It's Keith once again, and today we're going to be talking about this bad boy, which this particular one is the Sapphire Nitro Plus Radeon RX 570 4GB model. Now they do have an 8GB model, but that's not the one we're looking at today. We're strictly looking at the 4GB model. And part of the reason is with the upcoming GeForce GTX 1650 card that's rumored, the 1650 class, that's going to be competing presumably against something like the RX 580, which is priced in the upper $100 range, just under $200. But these particular cards, I don't know about this exact model, but you can get a Radeon RX 570 4GB for $130 right now, or $140 will actually get you the 8GB model if you really like to have that little extra headroom for your memory. But this isn't a new card, and it's been out for quite a while, but what we wanted to do is take a fresh look at it in 2019 and see just how well it's performing, and well, at this price, is it still a really good buy and something that should be considered if you're in that budget class. So we're taking a look at it today on our Z370 test bench. Of course, this is running the Core i9-9900K at 5 GHz with 16 GB of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM. Now, typically you would probably run a card like this on a much lower system, but if you're familiar with how things work, once the GPU is the limiting factor, it just is. It doesn't matter how much faster the CPU gets. So CPU is completely irrelevant here, except for the fact that there's zero bottleneck on all of these cards. Now we did compare it to the Radeon RX 588 gig and a GTX 1060 3 and 6GB variant. So there's 4 cards in here. The 1660 is not included in this because all of the cards that we're looking at today are well under $200, and that 1660 is just in a whole different price category and a different class. So you just catch up on one of the videos that we did on that card if you really want to see where it stands. So with all of that out of the way, let's start looking at the synthetics, thermals, and power draw before we move on to gaming performance. Kicking things off with 3D Mark Firestrike, we see, well, a pretty respectable number here. The RX 570 comes in ahead of the GTX 1060 6GB, but still quite a ways behind the RX 580 8GB, showing the difference between that core, the stream processor count, as well as the memory capacity and speed, because the 570 is a little slower memory. Time Spy shows very similar stories, except the 1060 variants do close that gap considerably and are pretty well matched for the RX counterparts. But when we move things into thermals, we'll see that the 1060 3GB is pretty much the coolest running of the bunch, featuring a dual fan configuration as well on that one. However, the RX 570 from Sapphire here is dead silent at 72 degrees peak temperature. What about power draw? Well, things change up a little bit here. The RX 570 is only about 10 watts behind the RX 580 8GB, but I know it feels like we're splitting hairs here, but the reality is 265 watts total system draw for this particular system is nothing to complain about. I mean, come on. How many people can't run that on, you know, a 450 watt power supply would be plenty to run this entire system, and these parts aren't chumps. Now let's get things off into the gaming realm. Everything that we'll be looking at today will be at 1080p. So, well, that's what these cards are really focused at. So 1080p with high to ultra settings depending on the game. And we're going to kick things off with Hitman 2. And while it did recently pick a DirectX 12 update, we're sticking with DX11 because the CPU has no real bounds on this one. And what we see here is, well, pretty evenly matched across the board. The RX 570 does edge out the 1060, and it does, and I know these 0.1% lows are very low, but you can see that the 0.1% lows are almost 50% higher on the RX 570, which is definitely something to take into consideration. Moving over to Forza Horizon 4, which has been a staple game for the RX 570, or the Radeon cards in general, and what we see here at ultra settings at 1080p is, well, the RX 570 has edged out the GTX 1060 6GB for performance. And while it is only 2 FPS, we're talking about a card bumping up into a whole different category there. And the RX 580 shows a decently healthy lead, but not enough really to justify coming off of the 570. Shadow of the Tomb Raider on DX12 at the highest preset with no DXR. No DXR is being used. So running this game, we see here that the 570 once again edges out the 1060 3GB and even edges out the GTX 1060 6GB and is darn near on par with the RX 580 8GB, showing that, well, it runs this game pretty well. And it is below the 60 FPS threshold, but I can guarantee you if you drop it down to high, you're going to cross that threshold with no problem. Rainbow Six Siege is a competitive game, and, well, most people are going to be running a high refresh rate monitor, and you'll see here that you'll be just fine. The Radeon RX 570 4GB outclasses the GTX 1060 in this title as well. It's really becoming kind of a thing to look at here. Moving into Far Cry New Dawn, which is, well, it's an AMD sponsored title, but it has been around for a while in the sense that it's using the same engine as Far Cry 5. But upgraded a little bit, and here we see pretty good performance across the board. Everybody kind of performs, well, right about the same. The game does a good job utilizing memory, so even the GTX 1060 3GB wasn't hindered by its memory. But when we move into something like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we expect to see some things shake up a little bit, but what we see here is they really don't. They kind of hold pretty strong. The 570 does stay ahead of the GTX 1060 3GB here, and is just behind the 580 and the 1066GB. The Division 2 just launched, and this game does, it's pretty intense on the memory, at least if you have less than 4 gigs, which shows itself in the DirectX 12 Ultra settings. Results here shows the RX 570 kissing 60 FPS, while the 1063 gig falls way behind and is just unfortunate. If you're trying to play that game, you're definitely going to want to turn settings way down, and that's just not fun. Battlefield 5 has been a fan favorite of Radeon gamers for years, and it definitely shows its prowess here at DirectX 11 on Ultra preset, with the RX 570 edging out the GTX 1066 gig and leaving the 1063 gig in the dust. Metro Exodus is the latest Metro game. It's running in DX12 with Ultra settings, and we see here that at 3 gigs just isn't enough still. While it only presents 49 FPS on the average with a 38.1% lows with the RX 570, you can see that it is just behind the 1060 6 gig and 8 gig so of RX 580, and if you were to drop that down to high or medium settings, would probably get you to the 60 FPS or better. And last but not least is Resident Evil 2, probably my favorite game of the year so far, and we're running here with DirectX 11. Something to note here is we are running it with the max settings, so not high settings. We're not staying within memory constraints. We're going for the absolute maximum default setting at 1080p, and we see here the 91 FPS that the RX 570 delivers is leagues better than the performance of the GTX 1060 6 gig. And interestingly enough, the 1063 gig, thanks to its clock speed advantage that it holds, actually edged out the 1066 gig, which was pretty crazy. However, 91 FPS with a 72 FPS 0.1% lows is nothing to shake a stick at. All of them perform well in this game, but the 570 is just rocking. So the point being, if you've got a 1080p 60 Hz panel or 1080 75 Hz panels, because those have become much more commonplace, or even a 1080 144 Hz panel, and you're willing to drop settings down to high or medium in some games to get those much higher frame rates, at $130, the Radeon RX 570 4GB is delivering exceptional value still in 2019. And quite honestly, ASRock's 8GB version may be a little bit louder than some of them, but at $139, I would probably go ahead and get that one just so that you have the memory capacity for who knows. But are you still rocking an RX 570, and are you happy with the performance? Love to hear it down in the comment section on that one. Or if you're looking to pick up a card in this price range, are you going to go ahead and pick up the RX 570, or are you going to wait and see what the GTX 1650 and 1650 Ti that are rumored might present and bring to the table? This has been Keith with WCCF Tech TV. Make sure that you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so that we don't miss you in the next one.